Cool. So we're going to start a deep dive on Serum 2. And before I start any of this, I need to give one warning, which is I have no idea how many parts this is going to be because this is one of the most deep plugins like ever created, practically. So today is probably going to be more of an overview of like all of the sort of features. I'll go into kind of the differences between Serum 1 and Serum 2. And I'm going to be trying to give an overview of like how everything kind of in here works and what everything does, right? Different sort of functions of things, but without going into as much detail. And then in later iterations of this workshop series, I'm going to go into detail about the individual things like the oscillators or the modulation system or like the filters and stuff like that, right? So getting started, before we kind of begin, are there any kind of specific questions about it you might have? No?
Not a graph pattern.
Cool. All right, let's get into it. So things that I can do. Put that up on that screen too. So compared to Serum version 1, one of the biggest differences is that instead of having 2 wavetable oscillators, Serum 1 now has 3 wavetable oscillators. We don't have cable for that. Just sorry about that. Anyway. And the other kind of biggest difference between Serum version 1 and Serum version 2 is instead of just being wavetable oscillators, each of these oscillators now has 5 modes that you can use, right? So there is the wavetable mode, which is the classic kind of Serum thing. There's also a multi-sample mode where you can load up samples. Say if we go to maybe this choir, we can go to like both or something. And now this oscillator. Basically, the way it works is depending on what note you play, it chooses a different sample in this kind of multi-sample pack, right? And these are, I believe, SFZ files that you have to either create or kind of load into here. Yep.
No.
Go. So it is Serum 2 day,
Serum 2.
part 1 of many. Yeah.
See better.
Yeah.
Serum.
So it's just talking about the different kind of sound generation engine types that you can choose from for these 3 kind of oscillators, I guess. So the classic one is the wavetable, which is you can use sort of standard synthesizer waveforms like this one, or you can choose from a bunch of banks of different shapes. Like we can do this distorted dupe shape, and now we get.
Oh yeah, when you said wavetable, I was like, you can
Yes.
do that.
Yeah, exactly. So the whole idea behind a wavetable is that you have an oscillator that is not a kind of fixed shape necessarily. You have an oscillator that is actually technically a sound file, really. You can actually kind of think of Serum as just a really, really kind of advanced sampler.
Oh,
In a
okay.
way.
Yeah, because you can like stroke through it, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Yeah, so you can basically think of it as you're taking a super short snippet of kind of an audio file, and then you're scanning through different short snippets of this sort of longer audio file that are all basically single cycles of a waveform, right? So that's kind of how wavetables work. And sometimes scanning through them is a smooth process like this, right? Where there's kind of like a continuous motion between them. Or if you go to the like default shapes one, sometimes scanning through the wavetable is like a stepped process. So you can just choose between, in that case, it was like 8 positions, right?
yeah.
I think in the case of a lot of other wavetables, you're going to have a maximum of 256 total positions in a wavetable, right? Yeah. So it's not the only engine that we get with these oscillators, though. We get the multi-sample mode, which I was talking about a second ago, where Fortunately, they do give you a bunch of kind of preset multi-sample files, which are in this SFZ format, which is not proprietary to Serum 2. I think SFZs are also used by programs like Contact with Native Instruments and like other like sampler formats, right? And basically, if we grab like maybe like one of these like guitar multi-samples, not only does it map a bunch of different audio samples across different note values, it also maps those different samples across velocity values too, right? And that lets you use this like a traditional kind of like sampler basically and play these really kind of detailed, realistic sounds with it because it's basically taking a different sort of sample for a bunch of different articulations that would be possible with an acoustic instrument or something like that, right? We've also got just this kind of regular sample mode, right? And this just takes whatever audio file that you want to put in here. So you can choose from a bunch of kind of factory ones. They've got, say, we'll do, it's like double vibrato kind of bowed sample. You can have it just play through that sample. You could also switch this from, say, like a one-shot mode to like a forward loop or reverse loop or like some kind of a tailed loop or something like that. And now it's going to loop back and forth if I'm the forward/reverse loop. Right. And then there's a bunch of other things that you can kind of do with these samples, like you can kind of go in and change things like the loop end over here, things like the loop start, make it so that it's like a tailed loop type of thing, where basically it'll loop for a certain amount. I believe exactly why the tailed loop isn't just working like a normal kind of like loop on the sample, but interesting. Anyway, other things that you can do with the sample mode is you can change like the sample kind of like start position, right? Or the sample kind of end position. If we turn this baby back into one-shot mode, now we can select just like a really short section of the sample. Display things like that. We also have this sort of loop crossfade amount, right? So if we do put this into kind of a loop mode, now what it's going to do is it's actually going to kind of crossfade the sort of in section and the out section of that loop. So it's going to loop a little smoother. Those with no crossfade going on, you can hear the click basically every time. And if it's crossfade up, right. Set that back to 0. And then just kind of going quickly through all of these, we get 2 more modes after this. We get granular mode and then we get spectrum mode. Granular mode is something that I would say probably has been around for a long time and it's kind of a lot more common in kind of synthesizers, or they make sort of specific granular devices like the one bundled with Ableton is called Granulator 2 or 3 now, I believe. But the way you can kind of think about it is you're taking really, really short loops of an audio sample and playing them back really, really rapidly in order to create this sort of like texture rather than just like a sort of traditional loop. So right now, if I were to take my granular approach to this audio sample that I loaded in here, You hear how that's like pretty different, right? From just like the
Mhm.
right? And a thing that you can control is there's this scan rate, right? So right now it's just playing through the loop at a normal tempo while it's also sort of playing back a bunch of different copies, right? I can take this scan rate and I can maybe turn it down pretty low to say like 20%. And now each of these grains is going to spend a lot more time looping through like a shorter section. Not a short section, but the same. And then you can also adjust the density of how many of these grains exist, right? So that's how many of these loops that are kind of playing on top of each other. So right now we're at like 7.5 grains. We can turn this all the way up to 26 or something grains, right? Now, when I did that, I want you to take a look at my CPU meter up here. Just when I play more than I mean, pretty significant jumps. And we have a huge grain density, right? So the reason for that is it's taking all of these tiny little loops and playing sort of so many of them on top of each other that it actually winds up taking up a ton of computer resources to do that, right? So that's one thing to watch out for when you're using granular mode is using a lot of kind of CPU specifically, right? There's also things that you can control, like the length of each individual grain. And you'll notice this has like actually a really big effect on the pitch of the sound that you're making. Because as you make those grains sort of shorter and shorter, they're looping a shorter and shorter amount of this sample, right? And that means that naturally, because it's sort of a shorter and shorter loop, the pitch is sort of just going to go up doing that, right? So that's only true once you get past sort of a certain length, or once you get sort of shorter than a certain length, right? Because once you get past uh, a length where you're essentially kind of changing the sort of cycle length of the audio waveform, then you sort of wind up just playing back more of the kind of original pitch of your sample, right? So if I'm it doesn't sound quite, different pitch wise than if I'm at like 4 seconds. You just hear those loops are a lot more obvious, right? Yeah. And then another thing that the granular mode gives you as a sort of set of things that you can control is kind of a randomizer for all of the different parameters, right? So you have a kind of start position offset randomizer. Also got this direction randomizer. So sometimes they're going to go forward, sometimes they're going to go backwards. You can randomize the pitch. Get things like create the atonal performance sounds. You can randomize the length of the grains. You can also randomize things like panning, make it wider and like volume. Right. So that's a way to get like a lot of interesting textures out of kind of granular synthesis. We're going to get way more into kind of granular synthesis itself as we're going along this demo of Serum 2, but I just wanted to show a few of the kind of options that you can use with it real quick. And then the last mode that you can use is something called spectral synthesis, right? And you'll notice that when you choose spectral synthesis, our waveform loadout no longer looks like a kind of linear audio waveform. It actually looks like a spectrogram readout for that piece of audio. Okay, so we're seeing not only time, but we're also seeing kind of like pitch information here, right? And the thing that spectral synthesis does is where granular synthesis is focused on kind of the time dimension, where you're basically taking either sort of really, really short or really long kind of sections of this and kind of repeating them over and over again. Spectral synthesis is really focused on the pitch dimension. So if you don't have any kind of sort of adjustments on this, other than one thing that I do have right now that is a holdover from the settings for the granular, is this sort of scan speed, right? So I'm still down at 20%. So I bring that back up to 100%. It's kind of just doing the same thing right now as just a regular sampler, although you'll notice that the loop sounds a lot cleaner just right off the bat, right? And this piece of audio doesn't have a lot of like really apparent transients in it, but the thing you'll notice is if maybe you put in some other type of sample, right? Let's go for like a drum loop of some kind into here, and I just kind of play through this. You hear how it kind of feels like those transients are really like smeared in a way? Yeah. So the spectral synthesis, it's going to naturally do some kind of transient smearing, right? Let's go back to this kind of like double vibrato thing. And then real quick, I'm just going to add a quick limiter because I was clipping a little bit on the master. That's another thing to kind of watch out when you're using this plugin is if you're not careful, you can really, really easily kind of clip using it because it tends to make a lot of really loud sounds. So get back to it. What's really kind of cool and fun and special about the spectral synthesis engine are the warping things that you can do to your spectral samples, right? And that leads us into one of the other main kind of oscillator controls for these oscillators is these kind of warp modes. In Serum version 1, you only had one warp mode per oscillator. Now we've got two, which is pretty cool. And you'll notice that in these kind of spectral things, you can do, say, like a spectral detune, right? You notice as soon as I turned that on, we got some like things that are happening to the kind of audio spectrogram here, right? And if I play this note, literally taking like detected individual pitches in the sort of frequency spectrum and then it's kind of moving them around, right? Or if I do something like, say, this kind of smear effect. Usually just has the effect of kind of making things quieter, I've noticed. Or there's this spread where you can take all of the pitches and make them closer together to like a center point or make them further away from each other. Right? So
Could you record that manipulation of that waveform?
yeah, you can actually.
The sound, pretty cool.
In fact, Serum makes it extremely easy to do that. All you need to do is, say, for instance, if I take an envelope generator, and we're going to get into the modulation system here real quick, but I'm just going to give this a little bit of shorter decay time, a little bit of release time, maybe a little attack time here. And then all you need to do to modulate a parameter is you click where you see this kind of like 4 arrows symbol, and then you drag to whatever parameter that you want to modulate. Right?
And that envelope is applied to that, right?
Yeah, that envelope is now applied to this parameter.
So when you hit the key that.
Yes. So when I hit the key, you get that.
Oh, cool.
Right?
That's
And
awesome.
now you see this symbol right here that says drag from here.
Yeah.
to the DAW that popped up. I can now just drag that note that I just made as an audio clip. And it's just instantly there.
When you say that note you just made, you mean like
The key that I just pressed, the sound that just came out of Serum, it records it in an audio buffer, and then
Oh,
it's just it's there.
whatever you just played.
Whatever I just played. Yep.
No matter how long it is?
I'm not sure what the length limits are.
Right.
Might be. And I also want to know is if I play like a chord, is it still going to? I want to make this kind of longer.
Yeah.
Let's let it go. And yeah, it looks like it doesn't really have too much of a length limit.
Grab the whole thing.
And so that audio buffer new system they have to just drag out whatever note you just last played is pretty amazing for just creating kind of your own sample library just really, really quickly. You can just be experimenting with Serum and just being like, oh, that was a cool sound. I'm going to drag it out. And then you have it saved without having to like, save this as a preset in Serum and also kind of like go back to, if you've made any like changes, have to figure out like specifically what you changed to, right? So super, super cool new system there. And then we'll get more detailed into the modulation system later, but one thing that I'll show right now is if you want to undo like a modulation routing that you've created, you can right click on the parameter that's being modulated and you can just go say remove all modulators in this right click menu. Now that just goes back there. So I'm going to go back to the wavetable oscillator for now. And I want to talk about a couple of other kind of oscillator controls that we haven't touched on yet. Up here at the top, you have pitch controls for the oscillator. So you can choose by octaves, which is really useful for setting up patches that have, multiple oscillators to them, or if you want to make something that is always kind of playing things in the bass register but not have to move your MIDI notes really, really low, you can just adjust octaves like that. You can also adjust semitones if you want to. This is good for example. Sort of fifth style patch like that, right? You can also set this back to 0. You can do a fine tune adjust. Again, kind of good for making like unison style sounds like that, right? And then there's this coarse pitch as well, right? And adjusting the coarse pitch is interesting because it doesn't move in octaves or semitones or cents. It just moves in like value, right? So it's just sort of like a continuous kind of pitch change without being stepped in any way.
And I'm guessing you can modulate the pitch change of the envelope as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we could modulate kind of any of these with this envelope.
Practically anything.
Yeah. So the thing about coarse is it mostly exists to be modulated because it's going to be modulating the pitch without stepping through values, right? So you get a smooth pitch modulation with that.
Yeah.
Instead of, for instance, if I remove that modulator and I modulate through semitones, you can hear it stepping through values. Right. So cool. Other thing to note about oscillators here is we've seen the wavetable position dial already. We'll get into this stuff in a second, but right here we have our kind of unison control. And what we can do is we can click here and drag and turn up the total number of unison voices per oscillator, right? So here's 1, here's 2 voices, all the way up to 16. And then we also have some other controls for the detuning amount of all of these voices, so how far apart these are in pitch from each other. And then there's this blend control, which basically will adjust the volume of the copies of the oscillator that are kind of in the center position compared to the copies of the oscillator that are in the kind of detuned wider positions. If you're going to blend all the way down, you don't really hear the detuned voices. And if you turn the blend all the way up, it reduces the volume of the kind of like center pitch voices, right? It's a little bit more apparent what this is doing when you're using an uneven number of total voices. So if I go down to 15, you can hear that that's like super mono. This is super wide, right? And then right next to here, we also have this gear icon, which is where we can choose unison settings in here, right? So this lets us change things like how these kind of unison voices work, essentially. So right now it's in this linear mode, which means that all of the sort of detuned voices are moved away from each other in kind of like a linear fashion. So they're all kind of equidistant from each other. We could change this to super. And if we turn this off, we can kind of see when we're choosing our detune, how the ones that are further away now are kind of further. If you compare that to linear, you notice it has a little bit of a different tonality to it, right? Even at kind of like a larger detune value, super sounds a little bit closer, right, to the actual pitch. Then we have kind of an exponential. The more intense version of super, where the ones that are closer to center are closer to the center, and the ones that are further away are further away. Invert is the opposite. Basically makes it so they get closer to each other the further away they get to the center. Then they've got random. Which will just kind of periodically, as you increase the detune amount, spread all over the voices, kind of in a random pushing away from the center. Right? Which can lead to kind of a more kind of chaotic type of detuning, right? You can also make the detuning of these oscillators apply to things other than just pitch, right? So say, for instance, we go wavetable position is something that gets affected. And now not necessarily going to see it, but basically not only are they getting wider from each other, but now they're also sort of like moving to a slightly different position in the wavetable. Right. And then there's other things that you can do here, like there's stack options where you can make it so that your unison stacks have maybe a voice that's an octave above. Right? Or in the 2 octaves, 3 octaves, or have like a pitch built in, or higher pitch pitch built in. Or, and this is kind of my favorite one, they have an option where the center voices are actually pitched down an octave, right? So a little easier to hear there. So detuning these is super, super powerful because not only can you have one oscillator here that you can stack up to 16 times, but you can do that 3 times, right, across all 3 of these oscillators. So you can get these really, really huge, wide kind of detuned patches in this sense, which is really awesome. And then other thing to look at is we have these phase controls for our oscillators up here. So when you're in one of the sample modes, you'll notice that these have kind of gotten replaced by the kind of loop controls over here. So what this does is by default, you're at a random phase of like 100%, which means that the start position whenever you hit a key is going to happen somewhere random inside this kind of wave shape, inside this oscillator, right? If you don't want that to happen, you can take this and you can turn it all the way down to say 0% random. And now every time you hit a key, the oscillator position is going to play back from wherever you set this phase position here, which you can sort of scan through basically the whole kind of wave shape, right? So if we go to 0 degrees phase, it's going to play back always from the beginning. And this has kind of an interesting effect on using detuned voices. Notice that you get more detuned over time this way. And you wind up with kind of like a stronger kind of start. So using no phase randomization, even if you're using detune like that, tends to help with making kind of bass sounds, so I've noticed. Versus if we turn the randomization up, don't have this sound that kind of starts very stable together and then eventually drifts kind of away, right? It sort of always kind of starts in that more sort of like drifted position, right? Cool. And then we're going to get a little bit back into these kind of warp options here for a second. What these do, I'm going to go ahead and turn my ESN voices all the way down. And turn that stack off. So what these warp options are is they're basically just additional ways to affect the shape of the oscillator other than just this sort of wavetable position, right? And the warp options are all available for pretty much all of the different oscillator types. You get a few more when you're using the wavetable, and you get a few different ones when you're using spectral options. But if we're in, say, like sample mode, we still have things like these distortion warps and things like these cross modulation warps that we'll talk about in a bit, right? But in the wavetable mode, one of them is something like, say, sync, right? So if I start playing this, we're able to kind of change the waveform in that way. And then we have these sort of like alternate warp modes, right? Where we can do, say, bend function to this. Or kind of negative bend. And so what they'll all do is they'll essentially kind of like deform the wave shape in some way. And so they just provide kind of like an additional way of creating kind of like complex timbres and tones, right? The thing that, so some of the other ones do that are available for all of them are things like this sort of like a low pass or high pass filter, right? Kind of see that it doesn't really affect the kind of like waveform shape here, but you can hear that it's just an additional kind of filter that you can bring in, right? And then another good thing to look at here is sometimes you'll get an additional control for a warp mode, and that's going to be like a variation. So in this case, the main dial controls the cutoff, and this dial controls the resonance of this filter. You can get particularly resonant. But that's a little bit, right? Then we also have things like distortions that we can add directly into these oscillators as well. And so the reason why they've added things like these filters and distortions is they basically allow you to apply effects like those to just like a single one of these oscillators and still have things like, say, the two filters that are built into Serum 2 plus all of the different effects in addition to that. So it just gives you a new place to put effects like that, right? So if I wanted to add a distortion in, I could do maybe kind of like a tube style distortion just directly onto this oscillator. Really going to kind of like square it out. Or I could switch to my sample mode. Apply the tube distortion. That's right. Back to wavetable for a bit. So now the last four are one of my favorite features of Serum. And those let you do cross modulation between different sound generators or different oscillators, right? So say for instance, I turned on oscillator B, switch this to a sine wave for now. You also have pan and level controls for each of the oscillators, so we can kind of pan them in the stereo field, or we can turn the volume down on them. I'm going to make the volume of this one down to 0, so we're not actually listening to the sine wave at all. But I am going to change the warp mode here to frequency modulation for B, right? And now, as I turn this dial up, we're taking this oscillator sound and we're applying frequency modulation from this other oscillator into this oscillator, right? One thing to kind of note about that is it works basically kind of the same as your sort of standard FM synthesis, except for the fact that we don't have the same pitch controls for oscillators that we would get in an FM synth. So we're not changing the pitch of these by like ratios, we can change them by like semitones, right? So if I were to turn this FM up, and then I could get, you know, an FM ratio by octave, right? Or another octave. I also have the ability to go up by a semitone. It's going to give me really kind of inharmonic mess tones out of FM synthesis. Right? So it does FM, but in kind of a sometimes weird way if you're not careful, right? There's also phase distortion. Phase distortion, apparently, when we were in Serum version 1, was the same thing as what they called frequency modulation in Serum 1, right? It's basically a less exact kind of version of FM is the best way to put it, where instead of adjusting the kind of like pitch of one oscillator, they're sort of faking adjusting the pitch of that oscillator by actually adjusting the phase kind of position of the oscillator. So it's going to be a little bit less intense. frequency modulation mode, right? But both of them are essentially doing the kind of work of the pitch of this oscillator, which is our sort of source of phase distortion or frequency modulation, is affecting the timbre of this oscillator, right? And then we also have amplitude modulation and ring modulation, which are both kind of similar. I love using amplitude modulation for very specific types of sounds. A little difficult to hear here, but if I turn the octave down on this, here we go. So what amplitude modulation does is instead of one oscillator controlling the pitch of another oscillator, one oscillator is controlling the volume of another oscillator, right? And especially when you use lower octaves to control the volume of whatever your main oscillator is, you get these really awesome, like rumbly, super great and then there's also ring modulation, which is kind of a similar thing. Ring modulation is a little bit different though, because what you're kind of doing with it is you're taking one sound source and you're essentially kind of subtracting it from the other sound source, is the best way to put it. And also kind of summing them together and then combining those two sounds into one thing. So it's basically the sum of these two things together plus the difference between those two things together, right? So if we turn this up, right. And then for all of these sort of cross modulation options that we have here, we can either modulate from the other two oscillators that we've got that are kind of the complex oscillators. We can also take that modulation from, say, the noise generator, which is over here. We could take that modulation from the sub generator, which is over here. Or we can actually take modulation from the output of either of their two filters, which is kind of interesting because what it lets you do is it lets you take the kind of whole mixed output of whatever you're sending to one of these two filters and then route that back in as kind of like a control signal for these kind of cross modulations. So it's not just one of these oscillators, it could actually be multiple of these oscillators combined, right? And then you also, specifically for the phase distortion, you have the ability to distort from itself, right? So if we choose this, now it's just using its own output essentially as kind of a modulation. Kind of noisy and chaotic as you turn it up. So kind of moving on to the rest of the kind of generators that we've got here. The sub generator is actually just like a really, really kind of basic version of an oscillator, right? We can choose between 6 different shapes for it. Sine wave. This sort of like dirtier, more kind of squared sine wave. Triangle wave. Sawtooth wave. A kind of even square wave, and then kind of like a pulse wave, basically, where one of the sort of ends of the rectangle is kind of longer than the other one. And then all we really have is a phase control for it and panning control. Through there, level control. And the ability to change octaves with it. Interestingly enough, you can go 4 octaves above or 4 octaves below with a sub oscillator. So not always for kind of sub frequencies. Sometimes it's for kind of a tone on top. Then we got the noise generator. This is essentially just kind of like a simpler, more dedicated sampler or sample player, right? So by default, Serum comes with a bunch of these different kind of noise samples that you can run that will loop pretty perfectly. So they've got noise recorded from like an ARP 2600. And you can do things like change the pitch of this, or just the playback speed of that sample, or do kind of like a fine tune control. You can also adjust the kind of start of it. Sorry, that's a randomness. It's going to randomize start. And then you can also switch this from this loop mode to a one-shot mode, right? So in one-shot mode, play through the sample once, which can be really good for, they give you these like attack sounds, right? So if you're trying to make like a percussion, like a kick drum, you can choose from all of these different like kick attacks. So it basically gives us the kind of like top end, kind of like clicky part of a kick drum. And then find where you can switch this to. Yeah, so if you right click on the pitch dial over here, you can also enable pitch tracking for the sampler, right? So now I can actually play that pitch instead of it just being kind of a default set pitch, right? And then there's a couple of other options here, and those are these sort of like color options right here. When you choose one of these, instead of this actually playing back a sample, it now turns into kind of a noise generator, right? So you notice that the controls actually get a bit different here. Now we have a kind of stereo control to make that noise that we've chosen a lot wider. Or make it mono. We've also got this filter control. It's just kind of a one knob high pass, low pass, right? And then we have a couple of different options for this sort of noise color. So we've got white noise, which is kind of equal at all energy levels. There's also pink noise, which is a little darker, kind of by default. Brown noise, even darker by default. And then this Geiger noise, which is kind of fun. It's actually trying to emulate kind of the clicks that you can get from a Geiger counter if you were in like a really radioactive environment. So you can use this dial to decrease the radiation level or increase the radiation level. Right? So super fun addition. Set this back. And you can also load your own samples into kind of the noise. Also put everyone just switch that back to alpha noise, turn it off. Right. Turn this oscillator back on because we'll talk about our kind of two filters. So filters have your sort of standard cutoff control, resonance control. They also have a drive control. Just kind of increase or decrease output volume. And then this fourth knob is always going to be a little bit different depending on which filter model you've chosen, right? So for most of the kind of standard filters, you're going to get this fat dial, which basically increases kind of overall volume with the intention of making it so that the low end doesn't get cut when you turn the resonance up, right? So if I turn this down, you'll notice that when there's no resonance, there's basically no difference between fat and not fat. But as I turn the resonance up when it's fat, we're just creating a peak there. Versus if I turn that down, it's going to actually cut stuff below the peak as well. Right? So most filters kind of do that if they are actually like analog filters that are in kind of a synthesizer or something like that. The way that they're designed is that in order to increase resonance, they not only have to cut kind of the volume above a certain threshold, but they also reduce the volume below that threshold too, right? Which it's making bass sounds a bit harder. So that down just makes it more bassy. Just love it. Yep. Keep it going. So we'll notice that we have a ton of different kind of filter models that we can choose from here, right? So the normal ones are all going to be a variation of low pass, high pass, or band pass, or they've got, say, like peak filters or notch filters, right? So the band pass is only going to let through certain frequencies, coming out both above and below. And then, say, for instance, a notch filter is kind of going to do the opposite, where it's going to cut away things in the middle. And then let them on the side, right? There's also a whole series of multiple filters where you get like a low pass and a high pass at the same time. Or say like, you know, a band pass and a band and a notch. Or maybe like or a band of peaks, sorry, and then you get like two peaks at the same time. Or like three filters at the same time, like a low notch and a high pass filter, right? So if we choose say low band and high, now instead of the fat dial, we have this like morph dial, which lets us kind of continuously morph between those three filter shapes, right? Without filter, not band pass filter, not low band filter. All right. There's also things like flanges, which we'll get into a lot more when we talk more about the filters in general, but these are going to be like maybe a comb filter like this. They're more for kind of like emulating things like phasers and flangers and stuff like that in the filter rather than being like actual filters in a traditional sense, right? Then there's got these kind of like miscellaneous ones, which do a bunch of different things. Say for instance, there's this like ring mod filter, which as you can see, isn't even really kind of a filter anymore, right? We're essentially just applying a ring mod effect to the sound through the filter instead of filtering it, right? And then we have these sort of new ones, which are kind of Serum 2 only ones. They just added a few kind of cool filter models. They have a DJ mixer filter, which is kind of fun. So it's kind of the combination high pass, low pass filter, basically. But when it's in the center, there's no filtering going on. And other big difference between Serum 1 and Serum 2 is that we now have two separate filters that we can set to be completely different settings, and we can change kind of the settings of them or change the routing to them, right? So say for instance, I turn oscillator B on, set this to a more kind of complex shape, and then set the volume of this up so we can actually hear it again. And you'll notice that filter one down here, we have these kind of like quick routing buttons to actually route things to this filter, right? So if we wanted both oscillator A and oscillator B to be routed to this, I'll change this to say like a low 18 or something. Now we're listening to both of these through this filter. Or I could go and I could turn filter two on. I could maybe make this something different, like say like a notch filter or something, right? And then I could make it so that oscillator B is routed through the notch filter. And I could do something like say, take this filter, pan it all the way to the right, take this other filter, pan it all the way to the left. Right? And now we have a routing here where basically these two oscillators are being sort of spread in the stereo field because they're being sent to two different filters that are panned hard left, hard right. Right. So with that, we turn filter two off for now. I'm gonna set both of these through here for a second. Set this panning back to 0. I think it needs to be 50. Be in the center? Yeah, perfect. We've also got this kind of volume level adjustment right here for a filter, and we've also got a mix amount, right? So volume level. Adjust the volume of that, and we can also adjust the kind of mix of the filter, which, as you can see, will essentially kind of let back in some amount of the audio that's being cut away, right? If the mix is not at 100%. So, anybody have any questions about kind of the basic layout of this sort of like top section with all the sound generators so far? So, no? Cool. All right. So, I'm going to kind of move on to some of these other tabs here because these are going to be pretty important. And then we're also going to get into the modulation system a bit and just sort of talk about a little bit more how that works. So the next page that they've got right here is this mix page. And what's nice about this mix page is that it didn't exist in Serum version 1. And all of the options on this mix page are technically available here, kind of in this oscillator section or in this effect section as well, right? But it gives you this really quick and easy kind of like a routing control sort of like area for a lot of stuff, right? So if you go back to oscillator, you'll notice that up here above each of the sound generators, we have this little button that right now that says F1. So we could switch this when we click on it to filter, main, direct, or none, right? Same thing is true up here. So above all of their sort of sound sources, we have send oscillator A to filter, right? And then we have a blend dial between filter 1 and filter 2, right there, right? And then we also have the volume for that oscillator is available as a control right here. We have the panning for that oscillator is available as a control right here. And then we have 2 bus sends, right? And so if we look over here, we actually have 4 kind of like output areas or 4 kind of destinations where we can send anything. We've got bus 1, bus 2, main, and then direct, right? And so you'll see that those are some of the other options right here for destinations for oscillators. We've got main, which this oscillator will now essentially bypass either of the filters and it'll go straight to this main section, which if we go to the effects, we can see here is kind of like on the main output effects section where we can add effects. Okay. Versus we've also got bus 1 and bus 2. So these bus 1 and bus 2 are essentially ways that we can kind of parallel process effects inside of Serum. So we actually have what are essentially return tracks like we get in Ableton, but inside of Serum itself. Okay. So you could do something like, say, for instance, switch this back to the filter, and then I could go to the effects tab, which is the next tab over here. I could go to bus 1. I can go add an effect and grab like a delay or something. And I can set it so that the delay is 100% wet. Then I could go back to my mixer and I could go, okay, oscillator 1 is now going to be sent to that delay, right? And what's interesting about that is you notice is that because I'm sending the oscillator to that bus that has delay on it, it's sending that oscillator signal before it hits the filter. So it's actually kind of like a pre-filter or almost like a pre-fader send that way, right? Versus I could go to the filter output and I could send that to bus 1. And now we get the filtered version in the delay. Right? And then another thing that you'll see here is we have these kind of quick routing options where we can turn on and off whether or not the filter is going to be modulated from envelope number 1. Right. So envelope 1 is kind of special in Serum because envelope 1 is always going to control kind of like the main output volume, right, of whatever our sound is. So what these buttons do is you can actually turn it off. And when you turn it off, it means that envelope 1 is now going to be the default modulation source. That's why you can kind of hear we're getting this clicks because I've set it so that envelope 1 turns on and off almost instantly, right? Versus when I turn that back on, now if I want to modulate, say, the cutoff, I have to go and find, say, another envelope generator and use that to modulate maybe my filter cutoff. Right. Remove that modulator for now. Cut off up a little bit. So you'll notice that you get these 2 bus send dials for the sub oscillator, all 3 of the main oscillators, the noise generator, and then both of the filters, right? You can do additional routing between the buses and say like the main output, right? So by default, bus 1 and bus 2 both go through the main, which means that if I were to say go to the effects tab and go to main and maybe add do like a distortion or something, right? I'll drive this into a little bit of kind of tube overdrive. So now go back to the mixer. Not only are we overdriving the delayed signal, but we're also overdriving a little bit more. We're also overdriving the kind of like just main oscillator signal that isn't getting delayed, right? But we can actually switch this to something like, say, direct out. Go to the effects. I make this a little bit more extreme. you'll notice that that delay is not being affected anymore by this distortion, right? It's kind of on a completely separate kind of track, right? We can also make it so that these buses feed into each other, which is kind of interesting. So instead of going either to the kind of main effects or direct out, we could have bus one go then into bus two, which then maybe goes to the main, or maybe goes like direct out or something like that, right? So maybe we could have the whole effects chain here in bus one, and then a separate whole effects chain in bus two, which everything from bus one kind of goes through as well, right? Turn that down for now. Go back to the effects tab real quick because I just want to talk about how effects work. So again, we have kind of a main effects, and we've also got two kind of separate parallel bus effects, right? So we're just talking about the main effects. In order to add an effect, you go here, and you go plus, and then you can choose between all of these different effects here. So we've got this thing called bode, which will kind of get into what a lot of these do more specifically, but we've got chorus, a compressor, convolver, delay, distortion, equalizer, filter, flanger, this sort of hyper dimension thing, phaser, reverb, kind of band splitter, and this utility. These last four are actually sort of utility things. And what they do is we can go in here and we can add a band splitter. And now after the distortion, we actually have this thing that splits the bands, and now we have a separate effects chain for the lows and the highs, where we can add maybe say like a compressor to just like the low ends, and then maybe we could add like this like hyper dimension expander to just the high frequencies, right? Right. So it basically lets us set a crossover point between our kind of low end for our sound and lets us process that differently than high end of our sound, right? It can be really fun to do. And it's a way more powerful kind of like effects and multi-effect system than Serum 1 used to have for sure. The other improvement beyond Serum 1 is in Serum 1, you could only use one of each of these types of effects at the same time. But now I could do, say, I've already got a distortion. I could go in and I could get just another distortion like after all of this, and I could have different distortion settings, right? And I could just sort of stack them on top of each other. And then another thing that you can do is there are some kind of effects chains that you can actually load up, right? So we've got kind of bass processing things, we've got sort of a bus processing. There's something designed for drums, there's like a main effects bus. And when you load up one of these, it'll basically just sort of add in kind of like a chain of effects that have already been preset to do with a specific kind of type of effect. So this is for some kind of a lead sound, which we can hear is just sort of making this really quiet just because of the nature of, I think, some of the utility stuff that's going on in here. It's pretty funny. But if I went to maybe a different one of these, say like a distort thing, right? So now we've got just like a sort of reset set of effects to add onto your. If you want to remove an effect from the effects chain, you just use this X button right here, which will delete it. If you want to just temporarily bypass an effect from the effects chain, though, you can push this bypass button, right? And you'll notice that there's also bypass buttons right here in the kind of effects chain. And then another thing that you can do is each of these individual effects has their own set of presets that you can load up, right? So we can go in and we can change this to a different type of preset. So I could change it to this like hard clip kind of kill sibilance thing here for the distortion. I could go to, say, kind of like a stereo width style kind of delay. And then I could go to maybe like an 1176 like punch preset for the compressor or something. Now those settings are going to be kind of completely different than the original settings from this effects chain that I wrote about. All of these, right? And then of course you can also save your own kind of effects chain if you want to. So if you've added in a bunch of effects in here, you can always push the save icon. And then there's also this button right here, which is going to show and hide the modulation sources, right? So let's kind of get into the modulation menu now. All of these sources of modulation are going to be down here in this kind of bottom section, right? So if we go back to the oscillator, this is kind of the easiest way to kind of look at everything. There is another view to look at modulation, and that's this matrix view right here. Okay. So you go back to, say, our oscillator section. I'm going to go ahead and grab, maybe we've looked at envelopes already. Let's take maybe like an LFO. We can click and we can drag this to whatever parameter we want. Now this low frequency oscillator over here is going to be controlling that wavetable, right? And then over here we can do things like change the rate of the LFO. Right? Or we can adjust, say, like the play direction of this LFO, right? So we could change this to forward or reverse or ping pong, which for this sort of triangle shape isn't really going to matter, but maybe I can adjust this triangle shape LFO to be a little bit different, right? So if I go to ping pong mode, yeah, it's playing backwards and forwards now. Right. And then you also have other options for these LFOs, like say, for instance, whether or not they re-trigger every time you play a new MIDI note, right? So now, every time I play a MIDI note, that LFO is going to start over from the beginning, or they could just be free running, right? Meaning the LFO is just always playing in the background, and whenever I turn on a note, it's just going to start from whatever it's at. Or there's also this envelope mode, which basically plays through the LFO shape once, and then you can kind of treat it like an additional envelope generator, right? So in ping pong mode, it plays backwards and then forwards and just stops. Which is pretty fun. Right. You can also like load up like LFO shapes in here, right? So if you want kind of like some kind of like rhythmic thing, they have these sort of custom LFO shapes, right? They're kind of fun, especially in trigger mode like that, right? Also, you obviously have the ability to do things like change from tempo syncs to the LFO is now in like hertz. Which of course lets you get up into, say, like audio modulation rates or something like that. You'll notice that you can also turn on and off the host BPM linking right here. So you can still be in tempo mode, but it's just going to sort of lock to some internal tempo, which I'm actually not super sure where you can control. So things like that. There's also things like you can, if we switch this back to just kind of forward mode, there's like a rise control, where if you turn that up, it's going to take a certain amount of time for the volume of the LFO to turn all the way up to maximum. There's also like a delay control. So now it waits a bar and then it takes a bar to rise all the way to full volume, right? And then there's also the smoothing control. You can actually see the effect of that this kind of like white line. So it's basically just going to take all of the kind of curvatures and get them kind of smoothed out. So you don't get a lot of like kind of clickiness or kind of instantaneous jumps between positions. And then we've got kind of like a start phase, right? So you basically choose the position the LFO actually starts in. So if we want to start from right here, you'll notice modulating that start phase actually kind of has an effect on the speed of the LFO as it plays. So that's something to think about, right? Especially since all of these parameters in any of these modulators can be modulated by something else. Yes, they can, right? So if we go here, it can be kind of difficult. You can see I'm modulating the phase position of one LFO with another LFO. So it kind of causes it to slow down and speed up depending on the other LFO, right? That modulator. Now you get a total of 6 of these low frequency oscillators. You get a total of 4 envelope generators, right? You also get 2 kind of like MIDI sources of modulation. There's note velocity right here, and then there's note pitch, right? So say for instance, you wanted to make it so that like the velocity of what you're playing controlled the filter cutoff, right? Instead of just the volume. We can set that up with the modulation here. If I play harder on the keys, the filter's going to be open more. If I play softer on the keys, the filter's going to be closed more, right? Normally you would have had to take, say, like the kind of note modulation and apply it to the filter cutoff for filter key tracking, but now they actually have a button that'll just turn on filter key tracking the filter, so you don't have to manually anymore. You can see as I play higher notes, the filter opens up more. Play lower notes, the filter closes more, right? And then you also have these 8 macro dials. And basically what you can do is you can take these dials and you can essentially use them to control kind of like other parameters, right? So make that a little bit slower, and that's going to be controlling kind of the wavetable position. And then maybe I am going to take this other LFO and apply it to that. We'll go for the phase. Seems fun, right? And then what I can do is I can maybe, I want to have this macro kind of control like how much that's going to happen, right? So what I can do is I can go to my matrix tab and I can go say, okay, I've got this modulation set up where LFO2 is controlling the phase of LFO3, and set up an auxiliary source, and that can be one of the macros, right? So I'll just choose macro 1 here. And now LFO is just going to work kind of normally until I start turning this macro up. Okay. So you can basically use this modulation matrix window in order to do things like use macro controls to kind of control the amount of other parameters, as we see right there. Or you can just set these macros up to control a bunch of different things at once, right? So I could go to, say, have this control the kind of band of this oscillator. I could have it kind of open up the filter a bit, and I could have it, let's do, say, like sync on this oscillator or something. I can have it control the sort of sync amount. What was that modulation source? Oh yeah, no, that's correct. Cool. So now I have this one dial that basically does a bunch of different things to sort of like make the timbre brighter, kind of more chaotic and distorted. Right.
I don't know how dumb of a question this is gonna be, but can you record sounds, like be changing serum filters while, like frequency modulation, all that, while you're recording? Is that something like it?
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, it's basically the way that you would do that if you wanted to kind of like record this. There's sort of two ways to think about it. One is if you wanted to actually just record it as an audio file, you could take an audio track and you could set it up so that it's recording from this sort of serum track, right? And then you could arm it. And then if we go to, say, timeline view, we could go ahead and just like hit record. And then I could play a note. If I hit pause, I've basically recorded that here, right? Now, the other way to do it though is this is basically kind of like a process of like printing what you did to audio, essentially, right? So you can't kind of like go back and edit it again. Other thing that you can do is you can do that with automation, right? So if I go here, if I turn on automation arm, and then I hit record again. Oh, actually, there's one other thing that I have to do before this, which is if I go to Serum right here, I got to hit this kind of right arrow key. I push configure, and then I just select any of the plugin parameters. So in this case, it's going to be macro number 5. And now macro number 5 is something that Ableton can kind of see for automation, essentially, right? So now if I go back and I hit record, and I go play a note, you can see when I started moving that whole thing was like red notch. Right. And so not only did I record that as audio again, but I also, if we go to automation view in Ableton, I recorded that automation of that parameter. Right. And so then what I could do is I could go in, and if I didn't really like this shape that I created, I could maybe like change it a bit by moving these automation points around, right? Go ahead and move that clip though. So that's more of a thing that would be specific to like whatever DAW you're planning on using. So like in Ableton, that's how you would do it. In like other DAWs, it would be done a little different way, but it used to be that there was not a way to do that in Serum itself. However, now you can, which is kind of wild. Serum now has a clip launcher built into it, right? Also it has sort of an arpeggiator, but thing that I want to show about the clip launcher is the way that it works is both this clip launcher and this arpeggiator basically can be mapped to like really, really low MIDI notes, right? So if I turn the octave shift down on my MIDI keyboard here, I've turned clip launching on, you can see that when I push these really kind of low notes, it's not sending those notes to keyboard here. It's just using them to kind of launch these clips, right? And you can actually put like note data in here. Make like really goofy here real quick. But the important thing to note is that not only can you create clips that have kind of note data in them, you can also add a macro modulation lane in here. And now you can go and you can basically add kind of breakpoints and kind of modulation points and change the kind of like modulation amount of that parameter over time within this clip that you can launch just inside of Serum itself. All right. So if I play this note, not only do I have kind of like a pattern generator, sort of like a piano roll that I can put in here, I also have automation that I can kind of put in, right? Which is kind of wild to me. Another thing that you can do with this, which I actually find really interesting, is you can launch this clip, right? And then you can just play notes. And you can essentially use that kind of automation that's happening in that clip as like an additional modulation source, like an LFO. Right? Right? So it kind of functions the same way as using kind of clip automation in Ableton, except it's clip automation in Serum itself. Right? And then you can also do like kind of weird things with clips in Serum as well. Like you can change the length of them. So we make this instead of 1 bar, we can fit. We can go all the way up to, geez, I don't even think there's an upper limit to the number of bars that you can make a clip, which is kind of terrifying, if you ask me. I'm already up to like past 500. So let's go back to just maybe like 2 bars or something right there, right? And then you can kind of zoom in and out and kind of look at the full kind of amount of bars here. You could also do things like change like the playback rate. So even though this is 2 bars, you can go like half speed on the clip, or you can do like, 4 or 8 or up to fast on the speed playback, which is kind of a wild thing. That's something that you really don't see in kind of like DAWs, I would say. Right? You can also like go and like take any clips that you put in here, and you can like transpose them all by like a semitone or something. Go all the way back down. You can transpose by like step octaves or something like that. And then you have like launch quantization for the clips, so you can set it so that they either launch after, by default it's set to like a 16th note, but you can set it to like a bar. So if I were to add something else into this clip, now they kind of launch like their clips in Ableton. They wait until the end of the bar. But you have to set that launch quantization like clip, right? So there's no like a default. You can also reset all those controls. Right? And then there's sort of this like re-trigger function where you hit that clip again, it's going to start over. Right. We also have this velocity term. They're actually going to kind of change the sort of like overall velocity of that clip, depending on the inputting like note velocity that you, right? Or there's sort of like this note gate function, right? Which yeah, so when you release a note now, the clip actually stops playing when the note gate function is on, instead of just playing kind of forever. And again, all of these settings are like per clip, right? We'll definitely get back into more stuff on the clips a little bit later. There's also a similar thing, which is this arpeggiator. So if you turn the arpeggiator on and we say play like a chord, that basically kind of just functions as kind of arpeggiator, but it's a really, really kind of like advanced arpeggiator, right? And you can also use these different notes, this little kind of like 12-note keyboard down here, to change between a bunch of different arpeggiator settings. Right, so we go from this one is kind of like a converge diverge thing. 16 notes. Change to like an up pattern of 8 notes. Obviously, you can kind of change these just by clicking on all of them too, right? Another interesting thing about the arpeggiator is you can have it so that the MIDI output of the arpeggiator just kind of pops out of Serum in addition to kind of audio, and you can route that MIDI somewhere, or you could route the MIDI from the arpeggiator into a clip player, and you could like record MIDI into the clips that way, right? So if we go, record right here. The arpeggiator is going in there, which is pretty fun. Go and kind of delete all the notes real quick.
Hey, Quinn.
Yeah.
So on the arpeggiator, the key, like, so it doesn't like affect the key at all. It's just like a different arpeggiator setting.
Yeah, so these keys down here, they're basically set up to be kind of like what we call kind of performance controls, essentially. So when you push go between these, they go between arpeggiator settings. They don't go between different like note values for the arpeggiator.
Gotcha. Okay.
You control what's going on with the notes just by playing notes on like a MIDI keyboard.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can set it so that the like ARP keys are locked to like a specific octave of the kind of MIDI keyboard input, right? So these are locked to the like the -1 octave by default, and then the clip are locked to the -2 octave by default, right? So instead of playing actual notes, when you get to those kind of octaves below kind of like C0, you're going to sort of launch the arpeggiators if this is turned on, or you're going to launch the clips if this is turned on, right? Yeah. So they basically let you use your kind of MIDI keyboard as kind of like almost a keyboard split situation, where you use the lowest kind of portions of it to control the arpeggiator settings or the clip settings, and then you use the rest of the keyboard to kind of actually play notes in, right? Yeah. And then a couple of final kind of like thoughts about the interface for Serum. We have some kind of like MIDI controls down here too. You can like take everything and try to transpose it just based on this kind of keyboard input. So want want to do that kind of for whatever reason, you can. There's also the ability to choose kind of a root note key and like a scale for the keyboard input as well, right? And it's going to function, I think, pretty similarly to the kind of like Ableton scale device, where it'll sort of stop you from playing notes that are out of key by just sort of repeating some notes across the keyboard, right? And you can actually choose scales that maybe don't actually exist in the Ableton sort of like mode settings. So we've got this like klezmer mode, which is kind of fun. Right? A little bit different. And then there's also kind of a swing amount, and this is going to affect, say, like the clip player or the oscillators. So you can kind of just turn swing on and off using this. So if we turn the art back on. And then another really interesting thing that you can do is you can now map the different sound generators to different sections of the keyboard, right? So you could do something like the sub oscillator only plays notes like, you know, B0 and below, and like oscillator A only plays notes, you know, here in these 2 octaves. And then like oscillator B only plays notes in like these 2 octaves or something like that. So now it's like, I'll turn my harp off real quick. So as I basically get to a certain point in keyboard, actually like switching and kind of muting and kind of enabling different oscillators, so, right? Which can also be really, really good for using all of these as like samples too, right? So you have maybe 3 different kind of sample players instead of 3 different wavetable oscillators, and you can kind of do a very kind of quick kind of sample mapping that way, right? Plus you can do it to the noise as well. Couple other things to note on this front panel. You have the ability to take the mod wheel control from, say, your MIDI keyboard and sort of modulate something with it. So say, for instance, we could do like wavetable position here is going to be controlled by the mod wheel, right? And then we also have controls for the voicing all the way over here on the bottom right, right? So we can toggle this being monophonic on and off. So now we can only play a single note at the same time, shuffling chords, and then we can turn up portamento. Which is basically going to put a kind of slide time between each note that we play in MIDI. We can switch this to always so that no matter what portamento happens. Where normally if we don't have always on, if we play notes that don't kind of tie into each other, then they're not going to portamento. There's also a legato button. And what legato does is that basically it means that when you have it on and you play notes that lead into each other, it's not going to be sort of obvious what's going on in the settings that I've got right now, but basically it means that the envelope generators are not going to retrigger, essentially, whenever you play a new note, because the notes are all kind of overlapping each other. Versus with legato mode off, even if the notes are overlapping each other, whenever you play a new note, the envelopes are still going to retrigger, right? And then another interesting thing that we can do with portamento is we can make it scaled instead of being kind of smooth. So we can actually have portamento. I'll make this a little longer. And maybe actually turn one of the keys on. Oh, actually, that does something a little bit different than what I thought. No, that's not actually applying quantization to the kind of slide. What it's doing actually is it is making it so that when scaled is on, depending on how far away from each other the two notes that you're playing that are kind of overlapping with each other are, you're going to either slow down or speed up the portamento time kind of dynamically, right? Versus with scaled off, the portamento time is always going to be exactly the same as whatever you set this dial to, right? You can make the curvature of it something that's maybe not necessarily as linear if you want to, but you can have it be kind of a logarithmic or kind of an exponential curve if you'd like. So. Hear how it kind of like gets sort of like pitched faster as it keeps going when you make it to sort of exponential curve. Right. And then there's one last kind of global tab that I want to talk about here. I'm just going to go ahead and reset us to say like interesting. What I really do. I want to go to the menu. Here we go. So up here, we have like a preset browser. So there's for the factory presets that we can choose from. We've got Serum 1 presets, which are all of the presets from the original Serum that it came with. And you can see we've got a ton of new presets here for Serum 2. Also in this menu tab, we have this initialize preset, which basically will reset us to kind of the default sound, which is just a sawtooth wave. We've also got this initialize LFOs and LFO mods, which is going to essentially remove everything that we did regarding LFOs, right? So any of the kind of envelope mappings are still going to be there, macro mappings are still going to be there, but LFO settings and LFO modulation mappings are going to be gone. And then there's sort of the init modulations in general, which is going to take every modulation that we've done, and we're going to kind of initialize it. So now there's no modulation going on anywhere, right? I'm going to go ahead and just go back to init preset, which is going to set us back to kind of everything, right? So now we're just playing sawtooth wave. In the global tab, you get a couple of things that you can do here. Over in this kind of user interface section, these are basically just things that you can kind of change about Serum itself. You can turn keyboard shortcuts on if you want. I'm actually not even sure what all of the kind of keyboard shortcuts are. You can change the default waveform view from 2D to 3D. So we go back to our oscillator. If you click on an oscillator like this, you can switch between the 2D and 3D kind of view of it, and it'll show you a 3D representation of a wavetable in that way, right? You can actually set it now so that instead of double clicking to have to type in a parameter, you can double click to reset to the default value, which is my preferred way of working. So I'm going to go ahead and set it to that, right? And then we also have things where we can kind of enable kind of MPE controls in here. You can kind of limit the kind of modulation depths of things, and you can have an option where when the transport of your DAW stops, it's going to silence kind of the note and also effects tails, things like that. And then you can set it up to sort of use the kind of like ultra quality whenever you're rendering by default, right? So if we go over here, we have some actual kind of additional controls that actually affect the sound more than just these kind of user interface parameters, right? So this is the voice control, right? If I were to go past 8 voices, I can go up to a polyphony of 32 here, right? But we only have voice controls for kind of a total of 8 voices, right? So I'm going to switch back to 8 by default. And we can do things here like each voice can have its own like pan value, right? So as I'm playing through, what we can see is going on is it's doing this kind of round robin cycle where every time I play a new note, it's taking up a new voice of the synth, right? But if I play polyphonically, those voices are all going to be spread kind of across the stereo field because they each have their own kind of pan setting, right? I'm gonna switch these back to default. And what's cool about this is you can do a similar thing for, say, the detune amount for each of these 8 voices, or like the filter cutoff for each 8 voice. You can make this different. The kind of like envelope amounts for each 8 voice, and then sort of the mod 1 and mod 2 are going to be this kind of oscillator warping kind of modulation dial for each of those voices, right? And what's nice about this is for all of these, you can actually add a certain amount of randomness. So I'm going to do kind of random panning. I'm going to add maybe random kind of oscillator detune amount. I'm going to do a little bit of random cutoff, maybe a little bit of random envelope shape, right? And now what we've done using this randomness on each of these individual voices, we're actually just adding in kind of a sense of kind of like analog style instability, right, to our synth. So basically, with that randomness on, we have kind of a little bit of like an unstable sound versus we turn the randomness all the way down. We have a very kind of stable, kind of like digital sound to the synth. So it really adds a little bit of kind of character there, right? And then we have the ability to switch between good quality, high quality, and ultra quality. Right? Which, in my opinion, are a little bit kind of a silly way of kind of putting it. But basically, the main difference between these modes is in good quality versus, say, ultra quality. There's going to be a little bit less like detail in the high end, you'll notice. Another thing you might have noticed is when I switched between good and ultra, I kind of got like a big CPU spike there, right? So that's just like kind of an initial thing, but at higher ultra quality, you're going to use up more resources than at kind of good quality, right? So that's why we have this use ultra quality when rendering option, is you can save CPU by turning it down to good when you're actually making your track and kind of editing things. And then when you go to render it, it'll switch to ultra quality and do the kind of like rendering process with a higher quality sound, right? You can also go in and if you are trying to write non-Western music in Serum without using the tuning system, say like an Hinton or something like that, you can change your kind of bass tuning pitch here. I could go to like old school brightness wars from, you know, the like 19th century and like tune all the way up to 450 hertz as A or something like that. I could do the like 432 tuning. And then you can actually load in what are called tuning files. right? And what those will do is they basically will change the way that Serum will kind of respond to inputs from like a MIDI keyboard or from like, MIDI notes coming from your DAW. And it'll actually shift the pitches of those MIDI notes around to fit a kind of non-Western kind of tuning scale, right? So, yeah. Cool. All right. We're just about kind of done with kind of like an overview of the synth. Does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff so far?
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess the first question is, does the Ultra when rendering apply to bouncing, or is that just exporting?
That's a good question. That is actually a really good question. I'm not sure. We would have to probably kind of like test that out by doing something like this. Let's turn on filter one. Let's make like an envelope shape that just has kind of like a big filter sweep. Apply to the cutoff of that. Give it some hold time. So right now we are in good mode, right? And then another thing that I might do is I might give this some detune so it's a little bit kind of thicker brightness to it. Okay. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag what I just did out there. Versus go back to global, switch to ultra. And then do that one more time. And then put that here. So the question is, do these actually audibly sound much different to each other? Maybe? I think so.
Maybe in like the first half.
Yeah, I think the second one did, like, the details in the high end were a little clearer, I feel like. So that is probably true. That depending on what sort of like rendering setting you're at, quality setting you're at, it changes what the kind of like sample downs will be.
And I guess the other question more generally is, now that there's Serum 2, if you're using it in like an Ableton production section, how often are you adding other things that, Ableton effects or VSTs, or are you just, do you just use Serum as it?
I mean, you can use, effects that kind of don't exist here. Like, say, for instance, like you don't get, like this is just like a 3-band or like a 2-band, honestly, like parametric EQ for the equalizer in Serum 2, right? So you don't get things like Fat Filter Pro Q3 or something inside of the effects, right? The things like the distortion is pretty well featured, I would say, and sounds pretty good. And you get a lot of different kind of distortion type options with it. And like, you get like a convolution reverb in here now, which is awesome. There's also a kind of regular reverb, which is like an algorithm reverb. There's like phaser, flanger. So obviously you can do most of your effects processing in Serum itself, right? In addition to that, if we go back to the plugins section, there is Serum 2 effects, which you can put on an audio track, and you get just sort of the effects section, and you can kind of run all of your sort of like Serum effects onto like other tracks. So like you could use like a completely different synthesizer. Interestingly enough, Serum effects also includes like the full modulation system and suite, right? Which is a little bit odd because you need to send some of these things MIDI input somehow to like trigger envelopes, right? But you could just use maybe like the free running LFO in this case. You could go add, say, like this bode effect, which is kind of like a frequency shifter. And I could go take LFO1 and I could add it to there. And then when we play through, Right, so we're adding that kind of boat effect to that audio track now.
Can you call a preset from a Serum patch into Serum FX or?
Seems like it.
Okay,
Yep, you can.
well, okay. That might be nice if you're like bouncing
Yeah.
stems or something.
Yeah, that could be good if you're kind of bouncing stones.
Yeah, okay, cool. Wow.
Definitely. Yeah. And you might have noticed that the LFO has become very strange looking, and we're going to get into what that is when we actually go deep into the LFOs in a later time. Yeah.
Wow,
Cool.
that's cool.
Any other questions so far? I think the next time that we do another kind of one in the series of this, we're going to do first kind of a deep dive into kind of like the oscillators basically, and like the sort of sample engine and all the stuff that these can do. And then we're probably going to move on to the filters, and we'll probably do all of the sort of details of the kind of modulation system after that we covered, and we'll also probably do like a deep dive into like the different effects and like all the types that you can choose from as like another one. So yeah, we've got plenty of lessons to go through here, because again, this is just one of the most fully featured kind of synthesizer plugins that I have ever used. So pretty good. Yeah.
That's really good.
Cool. All right. Well, anyway, any other questions before we log off for the day?
I was just gonna ask because I know since I've been using it, that basically sometimes when I'm running through the presets on Serum, they've been the like buffer, like it's telling me that I need to like put up my buffer size. And I have it all the way up usually when I'm like, when I'm
Yeah.
producing a track. And I was just wondering if there's like little settings like or like areas that you would like to go. Like I found out about the ultra rendering, right? So that's something to look at. But is there anything else that you'd recommend checking out, like that might be where the issue is? Because
Yeah.
some of them and they
So-
have like all the envelopes and all the LFOs routed to something, and so I'm like that probably uses up,
So the
CPU.
biggest thing that you're going to run into with the Serum patch using up, like you'll get the like CPU light come on there probably, and then it'll like you'll get probably get crackling too, and it'll say like, hey, like, you know, yeah, it turns. So the biggest thing is the oscillators themselves, how many kind of voice stacks you're using, right? If you've got like all three oscillators on and all three of them are using 16 voices like this, and if I try to play a note right now, like I'm gonna get not too much of a CPU spike because I switched over to good quality, right? But if I go to ultra, you'll notice when I play more than one note, we get all the way up to like 20% there, right? So the processor in this computer is good enough to handle a lot of that, but especially with things like, say, like the granular engine, right? I'm gonna turn these off. And then I'm just gonna load up like a random kind of like sample, like horn stab thing, right? If you take the grain density and you turn it up really, really, really high, and you also have 16 unison voices going on, right? What you've got is 30 grains playing at the same time times 16 unison voices. And like that on its own, just playing one note, I'm now hovering around 25% CPU. And it like doesn't even like sound particularly, you know. I'll go ahead and turn the filter off. It would be good, right? So really what it's all about is the quality settings and also kind of like the total voice count you're using, right? If you have like a big unison stack on all of the voices, plus your polyphony is like up to like, 32 or something, and like the patch that you're playing is like a bunch of notes at the same time.
There we go.
Yeah, like already that's like killing this computer, right? So what you want to do is you'll probably want to look at those oscillators and see like, okay, this patch is like really kind of stressing this out, I'm gonna turn down the unison amounts, or maybe I'm gonna like go into like the granular thing, and I'm gonna turn down the grain density a bit or something, right? And that should, in theory, reduce how kind of CPU kind of taxing it is. Right. Yeah. Cool.
Thank you. Yeah, that'll help.
Yeah, of course. Sure thing. Right. Anything else for you? Nope. Okay, cool. All right, awesome. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. And we're definitely going to be doing a good few more of these, so stay tuned. So, yeah. All right, here we go.
Thanks, Quinn.
Good luck. The recording.